Alright, so I know I might be a little bit late to talking about this film, but for the last week or so, YouTube has recommended me a lot of videos about this Pinocchio remake, and it seems like I've had a completely different experience with the film than pretty much everyone else. Cause you know what? I actually kinda liked it. Yeah, I know, controversial. He kinda liked a Disney remake. I thought we were supposed to all hate them. Yeah, and if you're asking me whether or not I think this remake was necessary, well, absolutely not. It wasn't. Just like it wasn't necessary to get a remake of Aladdin or The Lion King or Beauty and the Beast. None of these remakes are necessary. But Disney has just chosen to do remakes of all of their classic animated films, I suppose. And yes, these remakes are definitely of varying quality. And there are definitely moments in this Pinocchio remake where you can see that, well, they weren't given that much money to do it either because the effects look like shit. But overall, I actually liked it. But let's get into it and let's talk about what it is in this film that I actually like, and maybe some of the things that I didn't like as much. Let's start out with Pinocchio himself. Because when you're watching the original animated film, at some point you kind of forget that he's made of wood. And when you're doing it in live action, it definitely becomes more obvious that he is a living puppet. And I actually think they did that very well in this film. When you're doing a character that is almost human, you always run the risk of landing in the uncanny valley. And there are a couple of moments in this film where we touch that territory. Yes, there are a few scenes where the puppet is actually a little bit scary looking, but I rewatched the animated film and the puppet is really scary in that as well at some points. I mean, when Geppetto is chasing around Figaro with the puppet, you definitely see why Figaro is scared of Pinocchio. And you get that in this film as well, but for the most part, I actually think Pinocchio worked really well. I liked the character, I liked looking at him, and he looked exactly like what the cartoon Pinocchio would look like in real life. And another character I thought worked very well in the remake was Geppetto. Now, maybe it's just because he's played by Tom Hanks, and I really like Tom Hanks. I mean, how couldn't you like Tom Hanks? But he's really sweet, and I gotta say it, I like Tom Hanks better than I like the animated Geppetto. There it is. I also really enjoyed his workshop. And while it's dumb and definitely a cheap trick, it was kind of fun that all of the cuckoo clocks were basically Disney Easter eggs. I saw one clock with Woody from Toy Story, who is of course also played by Tom Hanks. I saw one with Donald Duck, one with Sleeping Beauty, Dumbo, Lion King, and of course Roger and Jessica Rabbit from Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which was of course also directed by Robert Zemeckis, who directed this film. And let's just round out the main trio of characters in the film by talking about Jiminy Cricket. In the remake, Jiminy Cricket is played by Joseph Gordon-Levitt, and I couldn't recognize his voice at any time. He sounds more like Jiminy Cricket than he sounds like Joseph Gordon-Levitt.
Kinda on the nose, if you ask me.
But I suppose that's a good thing. I don't know, he's good. I liked him. He's definitely less horny than the original cartoon Jiminy Cricket is. But yeah, he's pretty much the same. And that sort of leads me into something that I maybe didn't like as much about this remake, which is that they kind of changed the whole setup for the story. First off, when Geppetto makes his wish, they sort of cut off the ending of the wish in the remake. And I have no idea why they did that. They obviously shot the part where he says it because it's in the trailer. But we later find out that what Geppetto wished for was a real boy. He didn't wish that Pinocchio would come to life. He wished for a real boy. And when the wishing star sort of laser beams into the room, it bounces off a picture frame of Geppetto's dead son into Pinocchio, so Pinocchio comes to life. So the fact that Pinocchio comes to life is sort of a mistake. It was supposed to be that his son would come to life again, I guess. And speaking of the star, I always thought that the star was the blue fairy, that the star and the blue fairy sort of was the same thing. But here it's more like the star fulfills the wish and then the blue fairy just sort of shows up. And I don't really know what to think about that, because they've kind of made the Blue Fairy completely unnecessary for this story. She just sort of shows up and makes Jiminy Cricket Pinocchio's conscience. And that's the only reason why she's there. I mean, that and to set up the fact that Pinocchio needs to be brave and truthful and unselfish to become a real boy. But we'll get back to that part later. But that's the only time we see the Blue Fairy in the film. She just shows up at the beginning to make Jiminy Cricket the conscience, and then she disappears and never shows up again. Speaking of unnecessary characters, they've added 2 new characters to this film who are both kind of unnecessary. They both serve a purpose in the story, but they didn't need to be there. One of the characters is a talking seagull, which just sort of airlifts Jiminy Cricket so that he can catch up to Pinocchio at one point. And then she shows up again later to tell them that Geppetto went out to look for Pinocchio. And that's basically the whole purpose of that seagull. And I mean, sure, that is a purpose that the seagull is fulfilling, but the original movie did fine without that. The second character is a puppeteer in Stromboli's puppet show. And she sort of serves as a mirror or someone to teach Pinocchio a little bit about being himself. And maybe you aren't perfectly real because she has a broken leg and she walks around with some, I suppose, braces on her leg. And she befriends Pinocchio through this puppet ballerina. And that's fine. I didn't dislike it. It just seemed unnecessary for the story to me. It seemed like padding the story with something that it didn't need. Then later in the film, after Pinocchio's been to Pleasure Island and is about to set out to save Geppetto, the puppeteer and her puppet shows up again to ask Pinocchio to join their new puppet show. They rebelled against Stromboli, who was thrown in prison, and then they've made a new puppet show and they want Pinocchio to join them. And obviously this is a great opportunity for Pinocchio and it would be a good choice, but Pinocchio chooses to go after Geppetto instead, which then makes his donkey ears and tail disappear, telling him that that was the right choice. And I actually think that is a good addition. That sort of shows that Pinocchio's learned to choose between something that might be good for him and a great opportunity and the right thing to do. Because all of the other choices that Pinocchio has been forced to make throughout the story are between something that might be fun but is definitely the wrong thing and then the good and right thing. So now he's faced with something that is definitely a good choice for him to make, but just isn't the right one. So for that reason, I actually think that it did add something to the story, but it wasn't strictly necessary to tell the story. But while we're talking about the choices that Pinocchio make, I want to talk about one choice that Pinocchio actually didn't make in this remake. Now, in the original animated film, Honest John and Gideon meet Pinocchio while he's on his way to school, and they then trick him to go with them to Stromboli's instead of going to school. That is almost what happens in this film as well. But in this film, as opposed to the original, Pinocchio actually makes it to school. He does go to school, but he's then kicked out because he's a puppet. The teacher doesn't want him in the school. So then Honest John and Gideon show up again, and now that Pinocchio, who really wants to make his dad proud, can't go to school, going with them to Stromboli's puppet show doesn't seem like that bad of an idea. He literally can't go to school. He's been kicked out because he was a puppet. So why would it be a bad idea for him to go to the puppet show? Now, Stromboli is obviously a bad man who takes all the money for himself and treats Pinocchio like trash. But Pinocchio doesn't know that at this point. There's no reason at that point for him to think that that is a bad idea. So that choice is sort of taken away from him. He doesn't choose not to go to school. That choice is made by the teacher. Anyways, after Pinocchio finds out that Stromboli is a bad person and he's been locked in a cage, that is where in the original film the Blue Fairy shows up and Pinocchio starts lying and his nose grows long. Now in this remake, like I mentioned, the Blue Fairy never shows up again, so she doesn't help Pinocchio get out of the cage. Instead, what happens is that Pinocchio starts lying to Jiminy Cricket and his nose grows long, but Pinocchio and Jiminy Cricket find out amongst themselves that it is because Pinocchio is lying that his nose is growing, and when Pinocchio then starts apologizing to Jiminy Cricket, his nose grows inwards again. So that sort of makes him learn that that lying is bad and can quickly get out of hand, but you can remedy that by then apologizing and being good and kind. And I actually think that change is really good. Instead of having the blue fairy tell him that lying is bad and then just sort of magicking it away, Pinocchio learns by himself that he can make it better by doing the right thing. But after escaping from the puppet show, it doesn't take long before Pinocchio is in hot water again, because he's scooped up by the coachman along with a bunch of other kids on their way to Pleasure Island. And I gotta say, when you know what happens later on in the film, it's kind of sick to think about the coach being pulled by donkeys. At one point, the coachman, played by Luke Evans, even breaks out into song and starts dancing around on the back of the donkeys. That's pretty messed up. Pinocchio is then peer pressured into going to Pleasure Island. And when they get to Pleasure Island, there's another change in the story that I don't really think works. Because when they get there, all of the kids start behaving badly. They start stealing and looting and rioting and smashing stuff. But all the while, Pinocchio looks really uncomfortable. And he never actually does anything bad. He actually says no, that he doesn't want to break stuff. So why does Pinocchio also start turning into a donkey? Because my understanding is that it isn't just being on Pleasure Island that turns you into a donkey. It is specifically that they are behaving badly on Pleasure Island that turns them into donkeys. I believe at some point in the original film, the coachman says something along the lines of, "Give a boy enough string and he'll make a jackass out of himself."
Give a bad boy enough rope and he'll soon make a jackass of himself.
And like I said, Pinocchio never actually does anything bad. But of course, this all leads up to one of the scariest scenes in animation history, when Lampwick turns into a donkey. Now, it wasn't quite as terrifying in the remake as it was in the animated film, mainly because of the kid who plays Lampwick in the remake's acting. But speaking of Pleasure Island, I actually kind of expected them to somehow do something in this remake to save the children. Because after Pinocchio leaves Pleasure Island and all of the other kids have been transformed into donkeys, you just never see them again. And it was like that in the original animated film, so I sort of expected them to maybe follow up on that later and somehow save the children. But nope. Nope. Those children are just donkeys. They're gone. They were bad. Fuck them. That's just wild, man. They felt the need to throw Stromboli, the puppet master, in jail. But the coachman who kidnaps children and sells them off to the salt mines as donkeys, nope, he's still out there. Pinocchio then of course goes off to save Geppetto from Monstro. And in this film, for some reason, they've changed Monstro from being just a big whale to being a sea monster. And they really hammer home that he isn't a whale, he's a sea monster.
I dreamt that we had all been swallowed by a whale.
Yes, Father, but it wasn't a whale. It was a sea monster.
Which is, I mean, why? That's super unnecessary. He could just be a whale. Why does he have to look like all tentacly and stuff? Is it just because like we don't want to make whales out to be bad guys? I don't know. But that all goes down pretty much like in the original film. But that of course leads us to the ending. And this is actually where one of my favorite changes to the story occurs. Because at the beginning of the film, the Blue Fairy says that it doesn't matter what's on the outside or what you're made of. What matters is what is in your heart.
And the most important part about being real isn't what you're made of. It's about what's in your heart. So
as long as you prove yourself to be brave, truthful and unselfish, you can be a real boy. And Pinocchio and Geppetto all through the film obviously think that a real boy is a boy that is made of flesh and bone. But in the end, they both learn that that doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that Pinocchio is made of wood. He is just as real a boy as anyone. And they then leave it sort of open-ended as to whether or not Pinocchio actually turns into a real flesh and bone boy. But that whole thing kind of reminded me of this question with adoptive children and who their real parents are. Are the real parents the one who made you, gave birth to you, or are they the ones who raised you and were there for you through thick and thin and taught you to be the person that you are? My humble opinion would probably be that it's more of the latter. And I sort of saw an echo of that question in this ending of the Pinocchio remake. So I really liked that. So as you can probably gather, this remake is a bit of a mixed bag. There are definitely things that aren't as good as in the original, but there are also additions and new things that are at some points better than the original. I definitely don't think that this movie can replace the original animated film. I would still rather watch that, but the same can be said for all of the Disney remakes. However, one thing that I am kind of interested in is that Disney has announced that they're making an animated film based on the wishing star from Pinocchio. It's a movie that's going to be called Wish, and as far as I know, it's supposed to be sort of an origin story of the wishing star. That sounds so dumb, but like, I don't know, maybe it's gonna be good. Who knows? I'll keep you posted on that front. But that just leaves us with one big question, and that is, have you seen the Pinocchio remake and what did you think? You've heard my opinion, now it's on to you. Leave your answer in the comments down below. And while you're down there, remember to hit that like button if you enjoyed this video, and feel free to subscribe to the channel if you want more videos from me. But with that said, that's pretty much all I had for you today. My name is Martin Riise. Thank you so much for watching, and until next time, take care and so long.